It was the first day of winter. Stephen Council had been on his farm, working with his sons, operating the plow and preparing his land for the upcoming growing season. Time for supper was close, and it was around 8 o'clock when these strangers had approached him. The stranger greeted him. He told them that they'd been walking for miles, and he was in need for a place to stay for the night. At that moment, Mr. Council welcomed him in.
A few moments later.
The stranger's name was Tim Haskins. He was tired and stressed. He had been traveling with his family because they had been driven out of their farm, which was destroyed by grasshoppers. Mrs. Council and Mrs. Haskins gathered around the table as Mrs. Council was informed of their dire situation. They needed a fresh start. Her kids were tired and hungry and miserable. Mrs. Council listened, offering a hand and food. Keeping it together, Mrs. Haskins said, "We need money." And Mrs. Council was like, "We don't have money, but we have a pickle." Assuming it was a figure of speech, Miss Haskins asked, "A pickle?" Receiving a reply of, "We can help." In the other room were Mr. Haskins and Mr. Council talking about a new game plan. They had devised that Mr. Higgins' place was up for rent, and they needed to approach Mr. Butler.
Tomorrow.
Jim Butler was an interesting man because at one time he was considered land poor, working day to day trying to make an ends meet. Now he was the third largest landowner in the county, and he was in possession of Mr. Higgins' farm. Mr. Haskins approached him in an old shop downtown and asked him about Mr. Higgins' farm. Mr. Butler admitted that the condition of the land was indeed rough. Mr. Haskins asked if they could go take a look and make out a deal, to which Mr. Butler agreed. Accompanied by Mr. Council, they drove off from the shop and visited the farm. As Mr. Haskins, Mr. Council, and Mr. Butler all approached the land, they recognized that it indeed was in rough condition. As they surveyed the land, Mr. Butler proposed a deal to Mr. Haskins, which was for $3,000 he could buy the farm right now, or for a quarter down per month he could become a tenant and work the farm over time. In 3 years, they would be able to revisit the deal and pay the $3,000 that they had agreed on. Satisfied by the compromise, they shook hands. Admittedly, the condition was subpar. However, Mr. Haskins saw it as a birthplace of hope. The home was in lacking condition, and the kitchen was near non-existent, but he saw it as a place to raise his kids. From that point forward, Mr. Haskins had goals and dreams to achieve. He worked day in, day out, dawn to dusk for years, so that way he could make an honest living. He came home at night with blisters and sweat, but that didn't stop him. He continued to work diligently alongside his sons and other help.
One eternity later.
After 3 years, the land was starting to look respectable. He would stop and admire what he had accomplished because that was no easy feat. By this point, the ground was soft and fertile. The seeds he had planted had turned into tall, green, fruitful crops. Now it was time for Mr. Haskins to invite Mr. Butler so that way he could honor the original deal and take ownership of the farm. Upon arriving, Mr. Butler recognized that the house was in great condition. It was better than anyone could have expected, and the fence line was straight, and it laid out the property lines and kept in the livestock just as it had been engineered. They discussed the financials, and after long consideration and seeing how much work had gone into the land, Mr. Butler was quite impressed. The quality of the land was impeccable, and by his own accounts, it was worth more than $1.5 million, and that's what he told Mr. Haskins. Mr. Haskins thought for a minute and quickly grew angry because he had known that this was his money and his land that he well deserved. In a rush of emotion, he threatened Jim Butler. In that very moment, he saw his daughter and his wife playing off in the distance. Knowing that he didn't have the heart to take another life, he had no other option. Quivering in his boots, Mr. Butler came back and said, "If you don't pay me $1.5 million or get off my land, then I will kill you."